In the middle of 2018, I relocated to a different town for a new job opportunity. I didn't have much when I started working and moved in, so I went with the least expensive apartment I could find and rented the smallest space available. It was a single-bedroom place on the second floor of a small, 4-unit complex. The building was very old, worn down, and honestly located in a rough part of town. For the first couple of months, I was the only tenant in the complex. But since I only planned on staying there temporarily while saving money from my new job, I just dealt with it. Unfortunately, the job itself turned out to be way more stressful than I had anticipated. There were endless late shifts, mandatory overtime, and the overall work environment wasn't the greatest. Most of the time, the only thing I did in my apartment was sleep. One evening, I returned home around 9 p.m., exhausted and barely keeping myself awake. After coming inside, I slipped off my shoes and started walking down the hallway toward my bedroom when I suddenly heard a knock on my front door. The sound startled me, jerking me out of my tired daze since I hadn't noticed anyone outside when I walked in. I went back to the door and peered through the peephole, but the view was blurred. Either the glass was damaged or something was smeared across it. Unsure of who it might be, I opened the door. Standing right up against the doorway was an older man, maybe late 50s or early 60s. His eyes caught my attention immediately, not because they were friendly, but because they gave off a very uneasy vibe. "Can I help you?" I asked. His eyes widened slightly, and after a moment, he asked if I lived there. I thought that was an odd question, but I just replied, "Yeah," without putting much thought into it. He then smiled, said he was moving into the unit right next to mine, and mentioned he just wanted to introduce himself. With that, he gave me a small, awkward wave, walked toward the unit beside mine, and went inside. What was strange was that he never actually told me his name or gave a real introduction. I brushed it off as him being an odd older man, but didn't think much of it. If anything, I felt somewhat relieved knowing that someone else had moved into the otherwise empty building I've been living in alone. That night, I had a quick dinner and went to bed early since I had another long shift ahead of me. The next day, I got back around the same time. As I climbed the outdoor stairs to my place, I noticed the blinds in the unit next door shift, almost like someone was peeking out at me. The movement felt deliberate, like he had been watching me arrive. Feeling uneasy, I rushed inside my apartment. I told myself not to overthink it and brushed it off as coincidence. But once again, I had barely been inside for maybe 15 seconds when I heard a knock at my door. Out of habit, I looked through the peephole, but remembered it was useless. When I opened the door, it was the same man from the night before. "Do you need something?" "I'm kind of in a hurry right now," I said, trying to be polite while making it clear I didn't want to chat after a draining work day. He didn't really respond to what I said, though. Instead, he asked, "Do you know how the thermostat works in these units?" I guess I'm too old to figure it out. He gave a little laugh, but it didn't put me at ease. Hoping it was just an innocent question, I explained the basic way the thermostat functioned. It only had a couple of buttons, so it wasn't complicated. He nodded, smiled, and then asked if I could show him because he thought he had already tried what I described. I reminded him I was in a rush, and he apologized but kept pushing, acting a little passive-aggressive, insisting it would only take 20 seconds and that he really needed my help. To be fair, it was the middle of winter and freezing outside, so part of me felt guilty if he genuinely couldn't get it to work. After some hesitation, I finally agreed, thinking it would just be quicker to help and get it over with. He led me down the balcony to his unit, which already had the door wide open. The second I stepped to the entrance, though, I froze. The inside of the apartment was completely bare. No furniture, no boxes, nothing that even suggested someone had moved in. The walls were filthy, and the paint was peeling badly. Just from one glance, it was obvious this unit hadn't been rented out to anyone. What's worse, a foul stench seeped from inside, strong enough to make me recoil. He noticed me hesitating at the doorway and turned back, telling me, "Come on, it's just right here." His tone shifted from friendly to unsettling, and his face changed from a forced smile to something darker, almost disappointed. When he took one aggressive step toward me, I panicked and bolted back to my unit, slamming the door shut and locking it. A few seconds later, I heard my doorknob jiggling. He was trying to open it. I immediately grabbed my phone and started calling the police. He seemed to pause for a moment, almost as if he could hear what I was doing, then tried to use a cheerful voice, asking what was wrong and saying he just needed my help. He knocked a few more times, then finally walked away. The silence that followed was nerve-wracking until the officers eventually arrived. By then, the man was long gone. The police confirmed what I had suspected. The unit was still unoccupied. He had broken in and had likely been squatting there for days, probably watching my routine to see when I came and went. I have no doubt things could have ended much worse if I had stepped inside with him or if I had allowed the situation to continue. Who knows what his real plan was? I moved out as soon as I possibly could. This happened several years ago when I was still living with my parents. During the last 2 years I stayed with them, before heading off to college, my parents purchased and moved us into a different house. It was located farther from the city and away from most of the suburban areas. The place felt really secluded, set deep in the woods, and to me it looked like a mansion. Even though it was only the 3 of us living there, relatives visited often and stayed over. I think that was their reason for buying a house far larger than what we truly needed. Anyway, during this particular week, my parents were actually the ones flying out to visit our extended family. They asked if I wanted to join them, but I didn't want to miss a full week of school and have to deal with the catch-up work. So I chose to stay behind and look after the house. One thing I learned quickly about this new place was that I didn't enjoy being in it by myself. The house was so massive, with long hallways and empty spare rooms, that it gave me an uneasy feeling. On top of that, the property was over 100 years old, which was creepy all by itself. I was old enough to shrug it off most of the time, but the discomfort never really disappeared. The first day my parents were gone went smoothly. I went to school, spent some time with friends, and relaxed when I got home. On the second day, my routine was the same. School during the day, then grabbing food with my buddies before heading back around 7 or 8 that night. By the time I got to the house, it was already dark, and I was tired enough that all I wanted was to crawl into bed. I dropped my school stuff near the entrance and made my way upstairs. As soon as I looked down the long upstairs hallway, I noticed something strange. One of the spare bedroom doors was standing open. At first, I didn't assume anything was wrong, but that sight immediately brought back the uneasiness I always felt. I walked down the hall and peeked inside the room. It only had a bed and some random pieces of furniture. Nothing unusual otherwise. I pulled the door closed but couldn't shake the off feeling it gave me. What made it weirder was the fact that my room was at the very end of that same hallway. I passed those doors several times every day, and I couldn't imagine how I wouldn't have noticed one being open until that exact moment. I always disliked seeing open doors in this enormous house because it made walking past them feel unnerving. Before settling down, I did a quick walk through the house. I didn't check every single room, just looked for anything that seemed unusual. When I didn't spot anything else, I convinced myself I had probably missed the door earlier and tried not to let it bother me. It could have even drifted open on its own if it hadn't been closed tightly. I went into my bedroom, turned on the TV, and tried to relax. Unfortunately, it didn't help as much as I hoped. I kept thinking about how I was alone in this huge mansion with no idea what might be happening in any of the other rooms. Not that I believed something was happening, but the uncertainty was what scared me. After about 30 minutes to an hour, I started feeling hungry and decided to go make dinner. I left my room and walked back down the hallway to the first floor. Another strange thing about a place this size was that hardly ever were all the lights on at once, so I was constantly walking past dark doorways and shadowy corners. While I was in the kitchen, I kept getting the sense that I saw movement in the far living room. Every time I glanced up, the space was pitch black and nothing was there. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Everything was starting to play tricks on my mind, but I didn't want to give in to those anxious thoughts. I told myself I was overreacting and chose to ignore it. After making dinner, I headed back upstairs, but when I got to the hallway, I froze in place. That same spare bedroom door was wide open again. A chill ran down my spine as I stared into the darkness, unable to move for nearly a full minute. I couldn't explain how it had happened again. In that moment, I actually started wondering if the house might be haunted. I had never believed in the paranormal before, but that was before living in a century-old mansion buried in the woods. Quietly, I walked up to the room, pushed the door open farther, and looked inside. It looked exactly the same as before. I stepped inside, scanning for any tiny signs like footprints or moved objects, but there was nothing. Even more unsettled, I left and went back to my own room, this time locking the door. I sent a text to my parents, trying not to sound too worried, asking if they had ever noticed the spare room door opening on its own. They replied quickly, saying they hadn't seen anything like that and weren't sure what I meant. I told them not to worry about it and said it was probably nothing, but deep down I felt even more on edge. My instincts were screaming that something was wrong. I was sitting on my bed with the TV on eating for maybe 10 minutes when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I quickly muted the TV, and right after that, I heard a heavy thump against my bedroom door. My chest tightened as my heart raced. There was silence for several seconds, the entire house eerily quiet, and I was too afraid to even breathe. Then, whoever was outside gently tapped on the other side of the door, slow and deliberate, like they were softly knocking. I could hardly believe it was real. It felt like something out of a nightmare. For what felt like a full minute, nothing else happened after the knocking. Finally, I yelled out, asking who was there and saying I had already called the cops. That was a lie, of course, but I hoped it would scare them away. I knew I had to actually call the police, but I figured at that moment it wouldn't help, since it would take them at least 15 to 20 minutes to get there. The only reply I got was 3 more knocks on the door, still just as slow and calm as before. At that point, I grabbed my phone and really did call 911. As I gave the operator my address, she asked what the person was doing. Right as I began telling her they were standing outside my door, I heard a loud scraping noise drag across the wood. It sounded like someone dragging a sharp object against the surface. Panic shot through me, and I begged the operator to send help immediately. The doorknob rattled back and forth, but thank God I had locked it. Another minute passed before 3 more knocks tapped against the door, then silence. It stayed completely quiet for the entire 15 minutes until the officers arrived. When they finally came, no one was outside my room anymore. The only trace left was a long slash carved into the door, clearly made by a knife. The police looked around, but with so many windows and entrances, it was impossible to tell how anyone had gotten in. Most of the windows were old with unreliable locks, which didn't help. In the end, they couldn't find any real clues. My parents cut their trip short and flew back as quickly as they could. Nothing else happened after that night, but I never felt comfortable in that house again. Every hallway and spare room made me anxious, and the forest around the property felt even more threatening. A week later, I could have sworn I saw someone standing among the trees near the window, though it was dark and might have just been a shadow. Thankfully, I don't live there anymore, and my parents sold the place just a couple of months ago. Whatever was happening in that house, or whoever was stalking us inside it, remains a mystery. It was just another ordinary Friday evening for me. I was living alone in a really tiny house in the suburbs, but my job was an hour away in the city. Now that the weekend finally arrived, I was ready to do absolutely nothing tonight and just watch YouTube, play games, and maybe oversleep. After getting home, I hopped in for a quick shower, then powered up the PlayStation and relaxed while gaming for a few hours. I even opened up a couple of beers to enjoy. The night was going pretty well, and I thought the only thing that could make it better was ordering some pizza. I used the local pizza shop's app to place the order, then stretched out on the couch watching YouTube on the TV while I waited. After about 30 minutes, I realized it had been quite a while since placing the order, and I still hadn't gotten any texts saying they were on the way. I pulled out my phone and checked the app. It mentioned there was a delay. I don't recall the exact message, but it was pretty generic. It basically said, "Sorry for the delay. Your order will be leaving soon." It didn't seem like a big deal. I was planning to stay up late anyway. Still, I felt my eyes getting heavier. Maybe I was more tired than I realized. Over the next 10 minutes, with YouTube playing in the background, I slowly drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly from the doorbell ringing repeatedly. I jumped up from the couch thinking, "Oh, the pizza finally came." I had no idea how long I'd been asleep or how long the delivery person had been waiting. I rushed over to the door and swung it open. I was still really groggy, and the couple beers earlier definitely weren't helping. There was a man standing right on my porch. "Sorry, I hope you weren't waiting long." "How much do I owe you?" I said sleepily. The man looked slightly confused. I clarified myself. "For the pizzas? How much do I owe you?" Right as I said the words, I realized this man wasn't even holding any pizza boxes or anything. He wasn't wearing a uniform either. The man didn't answer right away, like he was still processing what I said. But then he smiled and told me not to worry. The pizzas were still coming. He stopped talking after that, just staring at me like it was a perfectly normal response. Even being tired and a little drunk, I knew that was a strange thing to say. Why would he be here if they were still coming? But I just said, "Okay." After a few more seconds of uncomfortable silence, I closed the door. I rubbed my face trying to gather my thoughts. Why did that feel so strange? I knew I wasn't in the sharpest state of mind, But unfortunately, that made me think maybe it wasn't as odd as it seemed. I put on a new video, sat back down, and kept watching, only to doze off once more. This time I woke up to a clicking sound. I wasn't sure what it actually was, though. I knew I had only been out for a few minutes because the video was still playing. I sat up and waited for a knock or the doorbell again, but nothing happened. I still didn't know what that clicking sound was. That's when I finally remembered to check the app for any updates on my order. I grabbed my phone, but before I even unlocked it, I was confused. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. I had placed the order at 10:30 and the shop only stayed open until 1 a.m. I quickly checked the app, noticing the order had been delayed for an hour before being canceled by the restaurant. But then, who had just been at my door? I stood up from the couch and walked through the hallway toward the front door, looking through the peephole, but seeing no one outside. I reached down to unlock and open the door, only to realize it was already unlocked. I must have forgotten to lock it earlier when I answered, since I was so out of it. I opened the door and looked around, but saw nothing, just a silent neighborhood. I was way too drunk and tired to be dealing with whatever this was. Without any answers, I shut the door and froze instantly. That noise, the click of the door shutting into the frame, was exactly what had woken me. My face went cold. In a split second, I replayed the entire exchange with the man, realizing my mistake and that he was pretending to be the delivery driver after I had already mentioned it. What kind of intentions would make him lie like that? I turned back toward the dark and quiet house. Every instinct told me to leave. I carefully walked down the hallway, reaching for my phone on the couch. Just as I grabbed it, I heard something shifting in another room. I panicked, snatched my phone, and bolted toward the front door. I ran outside the house and all the way down to the end of the block, then dialed 911. The cops showed up pretty quickly, just a few minutes after my call, but it still wasn't fast enough. The man was already gone. I gave them every single detail I could, exactly what he looked like, what he said, and everything. But so far, that's all we had. Unless something else happens, that's probably where it'll end. I keep replaying that night in my head, trying to figure out what really went on. But honestly, I still don't know. It seems like the canceled order was just an incredibly bad coincidence. The biggest question remains why that random man was outside ringing my doorbell at 3 a.m. in the first place. What was his actual plan? My best guess is that he was scouting houses that looked empty or easy targets to rob or worse. When I opened the door, he could probably tell I was drunk, exhausted, and not thinking clearly. So he figured he could take advantage of that. I even think he might have waited outside the door, listening to see if I locked it. Then he just waited until I went back to sleep. Had I not woken up or pieced together what was happening, that night could have ended much differently and definitely not in my favor.